Okay, we're live now. Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to our another virtual session. So you are watching YouTube live. We are from JUG Bangladesh. I'm Bazlur, your host. I'm from Dhaka. Where are you from? Let us know in the comment section. And there is a comment section in YouTube where you can write, you can ask questions. So do that. Today we have a special guest, Marco, joining all the way from Germany. Hey, how are you doing, man?
Hi guys, I'm doing well. Yourself?
Great. So how's the temperature over there?
The temperature is, as you can maybe see, it's quite snowy. So tonight it snowed like hell. So it's really, I don't know what's going on outside.
Great. So, all right. Those who already joined earlier, you know what we do over here. We do virtually. We meet up. We do meet up virtually bi-weekly. So that is every other week, and we talk about Java. All right. So today we're going to talk about Spring Boot, and everyone. In fact, it's a sort of de facto Java framework for writing web applications, web frameworks. So, and as you know, Spring Boot would sort of do many things magically. You can write a few lines, and it just start working. But then again, we want to know how it works behind the scene. So today we have Marco, who is going to talk about the underlying stuff about Spring Boot. So before starting, let me introduce Marco first. He runs a small Java consultancy firm in Munich, right?
Right, that's correct, yeah.
Yeah, it's in Germany. So he has been working as a programmer for more than 10 years. And he has done work in many companies, small, medium, and big. Okay. And for last year, he has been doing a Java screencast. He has a site. Hey, can you name your site? Or perhaps you can show the audience as well.
I can name my site. I'll write it also into the group chat. It's basically my name. It's Marco Behler. That's how Germans pronounce my name. But I'll show.
Okay.
We'll put the link in the comment section later on, and then you can have a look at yourself.
All right. Sure. So as you can see, he has a plenty of knowledge that we can get benefited from. So let's start. Hey, Marco, let's without further ado, let's do the session. Let's start.
Right.
Now.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Maybe just a quick background. So I've been working with a ton of Spring Boot projects lately, and it's very easy to get started with Spring Boot. So you add a couple of dependencies here, you add a couple of properties there, and suddenly you have database access working, and you have a web server up and running, but you have really no clue what's going on with Spring Boot. And then later on, when you develop your project, sometimes you have debugging sessions, you have problems you run into. And I always wondered what is really happening under the hood with Spring Boot. And that's how this whole thing started and how this whole little session got created. And I'll have a small coding session prepared for you, which means we're going to rebuild the magic that Spring Boot does for you yourself. And at the end of the session, you'll have a pretty good overview of how Spring Boot does things. So let me just try and share my screen with you. Right. Hopefully you can see me. Can
Yes,
I just get a quick, yes, okay, right. As you can see, I have a very simple Maven project setup. So there's nothing inside, it just has a POM XML file, and you have a main class. The main class does nothing at the moment. It just says, hello world, Bangladesh, I think, right?
Right.
And I think a very good example of to get into Spring Boot is actually to start with a web server. How does Spring Boot, when you just add a dependency to your project, how does it boot up a Tomcat and you suddenly can see a hello world page or whatever? And it's a very good example to understand the magic behind Spring Boot. And that's what we're going to do right now. So at the very beginning, you need to know the dependencies you need. And for Tomcat, you can go to a page like Maven repository.com or something similar. And I know already what dependency you need, and it's called Tomcat Embed. And you only need one dependency, and it's a Tomcat Embed core dependency. And then you have a ton of versions here, and it doesn't matter too much what version you pick, but I'm picking the 8.5 one, and you'll just take the dependency and copy it back into your POM XML file, and you wait for it to download. It's really just 2 jar files that get downloaded. And in case you're wondering, what does that have to do with Spring Boot now? I like to pick things apart, so take it part by part. So first, we're going to build the Tomcat. Then we're going to introduce Spring, and then we're going to learn how Spring Boot does things under the hood. So the first part is really just getting Tomcat up and running. And that means back in the main class, let's remove the hello Bangladesh, even though I'm sorry, I still want to say hello, but let's remove the line. And what you can do is simply say when you have the dependency, well, Tomcat equals new Tomcat. That's your web server. Not much to it. You can set a specific port, and usually in Java, web servers or server containers start up on port 8080, and obviously that could be configurable, but for now, Tomcat support 8080 will do just fine. Then if you think about later on in your browser, you're probably going to call localhost 8080. Then you have your context here, and then you have your real URL here. So what you need to do is, in Tomcat, say add context. You add a null context because you want to basically skip that part in here, and that's how you add a null context, like so. Then you want to add a servlet, and hopefully you all know how to write the servlet. Otherwise, it's a bit pointless. But the servlet is basically, it lets you display a very simple hello world page. So you add a servlet, and that's just plain Tomcat API. You can read about that on the Tomcat homepage, read the documentation, or you just trust myself that this is how you get Tomcat up and running. So you need a name. And then you will have to put in a servlet that we have yet to write in here, a hello world servlet. And then there's 2 more things you need to do. Is you need to put in a mapping. And don't worry if you think that looks crazy. It has just remotely to do with Spring Boot, but it really shows you what Spring Boot does under the hood. You put the name here. So this line basically says, look for everything after the context, which is null. So later on, you will simply access a URL, which looks like localhost 8080, and hopefully it displays you hello world. And then all you need to do is Tomcat start. Make sure that you throw the exception that Tomcat throws, and then you'll have to wait for Tomcat. Actually, you have to tell Tomcat to wait for incoming web requests. Otherwise, Tomcat will just immediately shut down again, which is a bit sad, which you don't want. And you want to wrap it in a thread so it doesn't block your whole main method. Forget that line, but that's basically how you make Tomcat wait for incoming requests. Okay, so you have these, let's say, 6 lines that create a fully working web server. And that is pretty close to what Spring Boot does internally as well, and you'll see that later on. Now, let's write our hello world servlet. We can actually make it extend HTTP servlet like so, right? And override the do get method, so you only listen to HTTP GET calls. And then we're going to make it really dirty. We're just going to write our HTML in here. So you're going to have something like HTML body. And maybe this stuff really works. And actually, let's put something else in here, maybe something like a timestamp. So you see I'm not cheating you. And the timestamp updates all the time. So local datetime now to string, right? Something like that. Hopefully you can see that it's a bit tricky on the small screen in presentation mode, but you pretty much just print out an HTML page. And that's everything you need. So let's try it out. Let's run the application. Let's see if I was actually telling the truth. And in your console, you see that you have a couple of messages here, that something started up on port 8080. It's an Apache Tomcat version 8.5, which looks fine. And now it's time to open up your browser. Go to localhost 8080. And yes, as you can see, this stuff really works. 2019, and the timestamp is updating every time I refresh the page. Cool. So that's basically all you need to get Tomcat started. Now the next question is, how do you get Spring into the picture? And I'm just talking about plain Spring, not yet Spring Boot, but just how would you introduce Spring to the picture? Again, you need another dependency, and if you don't know what you're looking for, go again to mavenrepository.com maybe, or a similar page. And I know you need just one dependency, one Spring dependency, and it's the Spring context dependency. You can pick whatever version you want, 5.13, 5.4, the latest one, doesn't really matter. You go back, put your dependency in here, and then you wait a second, and you'll see all the dependencies got downloaded, and there's a couple of other things that transitive dependencies which got downloaded as well. Then you might want to do something like put Tomcat stuff in a class called Tomcat Launcher, something similar. And in case you're wondering, I'm just putting all these classes inside here, inside the main class, so I don't have to switch back and forth, but obviously you can also put them somewhere else. With one method, public void launch, and then you just put that stuff in here and throw the exception. Right. And then with Spring, you know that Spring is all about application contexts. And you basically need to write a configuration for your application context. So you'll end up with a class, which is my Spring configuration. Something like that. Don't forget the class here. And then, as you also probably know, is you just annotate it with add configuration. And there's a couple of ways to specify Spring beans. We'll make it explicit here. And you're going to end up with a method called public Tomcat Launcher. And you simply return a new Tomcat Launcher. That's everything you need to do. Then you want to make sure that the launch method gets executed whenever Spring boots up. So you simply annotate that method with add post construct, right? And then the only thing that's left to do is new annotation config application context. You put in the my Spring configuration class, like so. And you have your application context. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. You have your application context. And then later on, your program will do something useful with the application context. But for now, what is happening here, you create a new application context. You specify the my Spring configuration class that will read in this class here. It will create a new Tomcat launcher bean, and it will call the post construct method. So it will launch a Tomcat. And hopefully that means whenever we rerun the application now, nothing changed, and you still get an up and running Tomcat. Let's see if that is the case and hit run. That's a bit exciting. And in fact, Tomcat starts up again. And just to quickly make sure, open up a browser again, go to localhost 8080, and yes, it is still up and running. So exactly what you wanted. Cool. So now you have Spring in the picture, and if you have only one bean like we have now, it's a bit stupid to simply use Spring. But imagine you're in a bigger application, you have thousands or hundreds of beans, and one of these beans is a Tomcat launcher, and you launch Tomcat with it. And the question now is, how does Spring Boot get into the picture? And what does Spring Boot really do? Imagine you're in a big application, and Tomcat is only one choice. There's other web servers, you have Jetty, you have Glassfish, you have a ton of different application servers. And it might be that you don't want to explicitly define your Spring configuration, but you want to have something like a default Spring configuration class. Imagine you have like a shared library in your company, and then you include that shared library. And the shared library should be smart enough to know that whenever you have Tomcat in your class path, like we have at the moment, so external libraries, you have Tomcat embed here, then boot up a Tomcat. If you have the Jetty libraries on your class path, then boot up a Jetty instead. If you have Glassfish libraries on the class path, and so on and so forth. So the goal is to make the Tomcat only boot up whenever you have that dependency on the class path. And there's a concept for that in Spring, and it's the conditional concept. I'll show you what that means in a second. You say you have a condition here, and that is Tomcat on class path condition, for example, which we have yet to write. That basically means whenever Tomcat is on the class path, then and only then create a Tomcat. And then you could duplicate the whole thing, and you could make it say Jetty on class path. Only when Jetty is on class path, then create Jetty. Something similar like that. Right. Now we only write our one condition here. Now it's getting a bit messy with all the inner classes. Right. Here we go. Actually, let's move that class outside. Okay. And now the question is, when is the condition true? How do we check that Tomcat is on the class path? And it's actually rather simple. When you go to the main class, you see that down here we say, well, Tomcat equals new Tomcat. When you scroll up, you see an import for that specific class. So your Tomcat on class path condition can just be, you try and say class for name, and you just put in that fully qualified name. And that will try to get the class file, which will be true when Tomcat is on the class path. And if it's not on the class path, it will throw an exception. So you'll have to do something like this. Right. You try to get that class. If that works, return true. And if it doesn't work, if there's a class not found exception, you simply return false. And that's everything you need to do. Now your code should compile. When you boot up again, obviously stuff should still be working. As you can see, is we booted up again and Tomcat boots up. That's perfect. Now let's try and remove the Tomcat dependency. Go to your pom.xml file. And how you remove the dependency, you could delete the whole dependency here, but then your code wouldn't compile anymore. And I'll talk about that later. But what you also can do is simply put the dependency scope to provided. Provided means that during compile time, the dependency Tomcat is still on the class path, but during runtime, it's missing. And now the question is, are we still going to see all these log messages here, or will Tomcat not boot up? And hopefully Tomcat won't boot up, and we will simply see an empty log here. So run the application. And as you can see, the process finished with exit code 0. Nothing happened. And that's exactly what we wanted, even though maybe for you as a viewer, it looks a bit underwhelming. That's exactly what we wanted, because we now know our condition works. As soon as we put Tomcat on a class path, Tomcat will boot up. If we don't have Tomcat on a class path, it won't boot up. And just to show you something, I checked out, hopefully you guys can see that. I checked out the whole Spring Boot project. And the very first thing that people will learn when using Spring Boot is that you have a ton of starters. So Spring wants you in your POM XML file, they want you to put in these dependencies here. And you have dependencies for caching, for batching, for Cassandra data, for FreeMarker. You have dependencies for everything. And when I started preparing for this session, I thought that you have, when you look at Spring Boot Starter Tomcat, you have all the code inside that makes Tomcat compile and boot up and start up. But when you open up the thing, you see there's just a POM XML file in here. And it's the same with all the others. So there's only just POM XML files in here. That means no code and only dependencies, Maven dependencies. And when you look inside the POM XML file for Starter Tomcat, you'll see there's just a couple of dependencies here. And you can actually forget that dependency and these two dependencies, because the main dependency is the Tomcat embed core dependency, the same dependency we put into our project, which means whenever you put in the Spring Boot Starter Tomcat into your project, all it does is just pull in Tomcat embed core, a couple of other dependencies, and then somewhere, which you'll find out later on, in Spring Boot, it says, well, we have Tomcat on the class path. Now let's start Tomcat. And if you don't put in the Starter Tomcat dependency, but put in the Starter Jetty dependency, then you'll just get a Jetty. That's really everything there is to these dependency thingies. All right, that is part one, sort of the whole talk. And if you have any questions to what just happened, if you don't understand something, then please let me know. Write me a question at the moment, right? Write me, and I will try to give you an answer. Let's have a quick look at the thingy, and I think I have to stop the screen sharing right now, right? Presenting to anyone? Let's see. Maruf on YouTube says, I'm new to Spring. I have some experiences working with other MVC frameworks. Can I start with Spring Boot without knowing Spring MVC? The thing is, what you'll hopefully learn in like 10 seconds or in 50 minutes is that Spring Boot is really not an own new framework. It is just a couple of, it's just Spring together made a bit better. So it doesn't make sense to say, can I start with Spring Boot instead of Spring MVC? Because Spring Boot uses MVC inside. And if you don't know Spring MVC, then you're basically lost sooner or later. So you need to learn the whole Spring universe. Right. Exactly, that's what Mohammed said. Spring Boot is a more extended Spring version. Then you have Amron saying a beginner can learn Spring Boot and also similar stuff. What I would do is I would try to create simple Spring projects, start with plain Spring, not with Spring Boot, and just try to get a REST controller up and running. Just try to write anything that returns you hello world. And then try to get database support up and running. And then try to maybe get caching support up and running. And if you understand how that works, then you can start with Spring Boot. You can also, that shouldn't be a cheesy plug, you can also watch the videos on my site. I have video courses on Spring and Spring Boot and whatnot. But in general, the Spring documentation is fairly good. And yeah, that's what I would do, pretty much. Let's see. My question is, if we embed the server in the Spring app, what happens to that server in the production deployment? What happens is if you embed a web server, that embedded web server will also run your production deployment. So it's not like in the past where you had like a dedicated Tomcat or maybe a dedicated Glassfish. You will at the end have one jar file. In that jar file, there's a Tomcat or an embedded Jetty or an embedded something. And that embedded Tomcat will be your web application. It will run your web application, and you won't have to administer a different server anymore. Right, and then let me quickly check on Google Hangouts if someone said something. Nope, there's no questions anymore, which means hopefully you guys are okay with part 1 of the session, and we're ready to get into part 2 of the session, which is going to complete the picture a bit more, because we're going to talk about properties and Spring Boot's property support. And in part 3, you'll see how it all comes together and how Spring Boot really is just an extended version of Spring with a lot of convenience added on top. All right, back to the screen share. Here we go. Okay, so maybe what we can do is just quickly clean our class up a little bit and just make sure we don't have all these classes in here. So we have a bit more space, only just the Spring configuration. Let's see what's missing here. Right. So if you have worked with Spring Boot before, you know that Spring Boot looks in different places for properties, and it automatically looks at these places and it reads in all these properties from all these places. And then not only does it read those properties, but it also configures a ton of stuff for you, the database access, web servers, whatnot. You can do everything with properties in Spring Boot. So you might have something like, and that's by default, the application properties file, which is on the class path, or in this case, source main resources, you have application properties. And then inside here in Spring Boot, they're called something like, for database access, spring.datasource.ul. And then Spring Datasource, I think it's called driver class name. And then here you'd have your JDBC MySQL, actually like so, MySQL UL. And you'd have your MySQL driver, something like that, something similar. But then let me see if I can find the right key to comment out that stuff. You don't have the just the application properties file, but you also have, let's say, different environments. And you want to have for production, you want to have your own properties file. And Spring Boot will also try to look into these environment-specific properties files. Spring Boot will also look into properties which are not on the class path, but are in the same directory where your Spring application lives. And there's a couple of different places where Spring Boot looks at these files. And I find this documentation page, actually, when you look for Spring Boot externalize configuration, I think, which I find a bit tricky to find, to be honest. But when you're on that page, you'll see that there's 17 different places where Spring Boot will look for properties files. And it's a quick homework session for you to look at all these different places. But when you have a look inside, you'll see that the Spring Boot looks at, for example, the Java system properties. It will look at environment variables that you set in your operating system, so in Windows or in Linux or whatever. It will have a look at application-profile. That's what we just talked about. It will have a look at application properties inside and outside of your Java application. That's also what we just talked about. And there's a couple of more locations. And also these locations have a specific order. So if you have a command line argument up here, it will always override default properties or the properties inside your jar file, application properties. So you now know, well, by default, Spring Boot just looks at different places. And how can we build the same thing? And we'll make it easy. We're not going to implement all these 17 places. We're just going to try to get a couple of them up and running. So back in your application, There's a couple of different ways in the Spring world how you can do it, but one way would be to have something like, which is called a property source. And the property source has a value. We can simply say, well, read in application properties from the class path. Actually, let's delete these two files because I want to show you something. Right, like so. And then we run the application. And then you get an exception saying that the resource application properties cannot be opened because it does not exist. And that's because Spring, by default, just throws an exception whenever it tries to find a properties file which doesn't exist. And that's pretty much one of the major Spring Boot thingies. They just ignore these exceptions. And there's a flag which you can set. And it's the ignore resource not found flag. Ignore resource not found to true. Now your application should boot up and no one should care anymore, right? You just get like an information here that this file doesn't exist. And then what they do in Spring Boot is really just saying, well, by default, in that magic default configuration, you not only have one property source, but you have 17 property sources. We have to make that an array here, like so. A bit more space. So you have one property source on your class path. You have one property source, a file, which means in the same directory as your jar file. You have one property source where you could say, right, on the class path, but instead of application, you want to have, and you can put placeholders in here, Spring profiles active properties, which means now if you set that property and run your application with it, Spring will also have a look at an application properties file with that profile name. And hopefully it will not throw an exception, right? So let's try that again. Run the application. Exactly. You just get a couple of warnings saying that these properties are not resolvable, but Spring Boot would actually have a look inside all of these different properties files. And as an exercise, because it takes a bit too long in this session, I want you to, I can share the code with you later on, and I want you to then play with these resources and just create them and find out which property file overrides what, if you change the order here between these property sources and whatnot. But again, Spring Boot, and you'll see it in hopefully a couple of minutes, just defines these property sources by default, and it's just 17 instead of the 3 we have here. But that's why, again, Spring Boot is just an extension. It's not like something new. It just uses whatever is in Spring, and it puts some defaults up here. All right. Then we go back. Let me just have a quick look at my notes. Right. Imagine, and that's the second use case. It's a very popular use case with Spring Boot is that you define. So first of all, let's create a file here. Let's say that file is called application properties. And then, as I just said, if you define these properties here, private class name, and then Spring Datasource.ul, then you get access to a database. And you get a data source, which is in Java terms, the access to your database. And then you can just run your SQL queries, whatever you want to run, basically. And I don't want to use MySQL or Oracle or Postgres because it's too much installation effort for this session. I just want to use an embedded database, and it's the H2 database. And for that, you can simply write the URL is jdbc:/h2:mem. And then we have to put the driver in here. But first of all, we need to add H2 to our project. Right, so you go to mavenrepository.com again. You search for H2. Just pick the latest version. And that's basically your database, your whole database, everything you need. Put it in here. Make sure to delete the scope. And then I also want a couple of my helper classes from Spring that help me with database. So I'll just put in the Spring JDBC dependencies as well. And after a quick while, you should see, well, your H2 database is here and your JDBC dependency is also in the project. Good. We can finish up our application properties file because now we can say, well, use the H2 driver. Now it would be nice if our application simply created a data source, a fully working data source, and if we could just run a couple of SQL statements. And I'll take the ending away. What I want to do is I want to do something like similar. There's a couple of ways to do the same thing, but I want to get a data source from our application context, like so, the data source. Then I get a connection from the data source. Let's run with try catch. Actually, let's make it proper, like so, right? And then we're just going to use some plain SQL on that connection. So connection create statement, execute query. We're just going to execute a SQL query. And then the H2 database has a function called random UUID. That's random. So all we do is we select a random number or a random string from the database. Right. Nothing too exciting. Let's see. We get a result set back. And then the Java way of doing things is pretty much just saying something like this. So we print out from the result set, we print out the random column, and random is the name we gave our random UUID. So all that code does is get the data source, open up a connection, a database connection, then execute a query, which will hopefully return us a random string. So if we now run the application again, hopefully it fails. If that doesn't fail now, we have a problem because we just specified some properties. And well, let's see. Right? What we get is what I expected and what I hoped for is that we have no bean of type data source. Exactly. Because that's the missing link. The data source isn't being created. And the way we do it is rather simple. Just make a new bean up here. Make it a data source, right, like so. And now the question is, how can you access the properties in here? Because you want to return something like there's many different data sources in Java. But for now, we'll just use a simple driver data source because it needs two things. It needs a driver and a URL, and that's exactly what we have in our properties file. And there's a couple of ways of doing that. I'll just show you one way, and it's certainly not the best way, but you can inject an environment, a Spring environment, into the data source method. And then you can say, environment, please give me the property for the driver. And also environment get property for the URL. Right? Like so. Right. And just to make no mistakes, we just copy and paste this key in here. So that's for the driver. Go back. That's for the URL. Something like that. And then you want to instantiate the driver. Again, there's a couple of different ways of how you do that, but one is by using reflection. So you'll just say class for name driver new instance. There's going to be a couple of exceptions being thrown. Don't worry too much about what is going on here. Like so. Cast it later on and put in the UL. Right, like so. So now you create a data source, you read in the properties, and you just say, well, there's going to be a simple driver data source for that driver and for that UL. And now our code should work. Let's see. We rerun it. And yes, we get a random number in the console, which means everything is working as expected. When you rerun it, you get different numbers, which is great. What has that got to do with Spring Boot? Because again, in Spring Boot, there's a default Spring configuration, and all of this stuff is conditional, because what happens now when you delete these two properties, so, and rerun, you get an exception. You just get a null pointer exception, because somewhere inside here, right, if you go down here, somewhere here, the null pointer is being thrown. So you need another condition. And that condition is that, let's maybe call it activate data source condition. Something like that. We can create that class again. Right. Implement the method. I'll just put it up here. And I'll take it away. It's rather simple. What you can do is, well, we'll just copy these two thingies. The condition should be that, right, context get environment contains property. So you want to make sure that this property is there, right? And you also want to make sure that the other property is there. So only if both properties are there, like so, then the data source should get enabled. Make sure to put in a return statement here, but that basically says only if you find these two properties, driver class name, data source, then create a new data source. Otherwise, don't create a data source. So as we now deleted the properties and rerun the application, we should probably get another exception again saying exactly, there is no data source available. That's right. And if we go to the application properties file again and paste, oh no, I just made a quick mistake, but no worries, like so. And just copy in this line again. We should hopefully get our database back. Right, let's try it out. Pretty cool. We get our random string back again. And that is basically, again, what happens in Spring Boot, and that somewhat finishes part 2, because now in part 3, you're going to see how Spring Boot really does it, or how Spring Boot does it. But in the end, Spring Boot by default just looks at a couple of different places where it finds properties. And then when it finds specific properties, it will just create new beans, just like your data source or your Tomcat launcher. All right, let me get back to the questions. Let me see if there was any new questions. Stop the screen share. Right.
We have a couple of questions, I think.
Yes. Shoot.
Yeah, you can read them as well, or
Excellent.
I can.
Okay, let me see where we stopped with the questions. Right. Aha. Okay, let's start with Ahmed. Which properties files out of the 17 you use on your projects, and on which cases? I mean, are there any special use cases? All right, so what I think is by default, you'll just start with an application properties file. You'll just put the application properties file inside your project. And don't think about all the 17 at the beginning, just make it really, really, really simple. At the very beginning, you have one properties file. And then later on, very likely, you're going to have a different database in production than in environment, which means you need a second properties file. And now it depends a bit, because what you're likely going to have is maybe a properties file on your production server in a specific directory or in the same directory as your Spring Boot application. Or it could be that you want to do with profiling, or both together actually, that you have specific profile properties that you either serve with your application or also put on the application server. But I would make it really simple. And at the beginning, start with one properties file, and then override properties for production, or maybe for testing also, because usually you have development, testing, production, something similar. But keep it simple. Don't use all the 17 different places. All right. Next question is, why is the term microservice so well with Spring Boot? What makes Spring Boot suitable for running it as a microservice, and how are they possible with vanilla Spring? The thing is, as you saw, is that Spring Boot by default uses an embedded web server. And what I cannot show you in this session because it's too short is that in the end, you just have one big jar file. Whenever you build a Spring Boot project, you end up with one big jar file. It has everything inside, the web server inside, all your code inside, everything inside. And then you can take that jar file, put it onto any machine that runs Java, and just boot it up, and you have a web server up and running. And most of the time, that means having nowadays a microservice up and running and whatnot. And you don't have to configure your own web server or install anything on your machines. You only need Java. And then with your Spring Boot project, you can just go crazy and create as many microservices as you want. Again, is it possible with vanilla Spring? You have to imagine that Spring Boot is really just vanilla Spring with a ton of things on top, like these conditional statements. And you can either use vanilla Spring and recode everything we do now. So how do you get an embedded Tomcat up and running? How do you get a Datasource up and running? Or you just use Spring Boot and you have these beans by default. All right. Next question is, can you go a little bit into explanation into POM and Maven? What's scope, build, etc.? Well, the thing is, I would love to go into Maven again. It's probably better for a different session. But the POM file in Maven, to make it really simple, in your POM file in Maven, you can what you saw is you can specify dependencies that your project needs. So you say you need a database driver, you put it into your POM file. You need some other stuff like we did with Spring, you put it into your POM file, and the Maven will automatically download these dependencies into your project, which is quite nice. And Maven can also do a couple of other things, like build your project and deploy your project with plugins and whatnot. But for now, we just use it with dependency management. And for scopes, I'd like you to read up about it, because I cannot just give you a 2-sentence explanation. But just keep in mind that whenever you get a dependency, the dependency can be there during compile time. So when you compile your project on your machine, it can be there during runtime. When you run the project on the production server, it can be there at both different times, and that's what the scope is for. All right. Next question is Spring Boot suitable for large-scale applications like large enterprise applications? Were there lots of single project? Sure. I mean, it has nothing to do with Spring Boot, actually. I mean, the project I'm working on at the moment has, I don't know, 100 people working on it, Spring Boot sprinkled in it. It's a big project. It doesn't, Spring Boot has nothing to do with the size of your project. So, because in the end, you will likely have one web module, your web server, and you'll have a ton of different other modules. And if you go microservices anyway, you'll have completely different projects independent from each other. But sure, I mean, Spring Boot works just fine for any type of project. Is there any way to know the property name I'm providing in application properties is correct at compile time? The funny thing is there's not really a way. You can read about it in the documentation, and IntelliJ is actually smart enough I think maybe only if you have a license key for the Ultimate Edition, it's smart enough to correct you at compile time. So it will know you have added some Spring Boot dependencies to your project, and it will tell you if there was a mistake. It's not 100% sure, but it's pretty much, it helps a lot. Right, next question is, for production deployment of Spring Boot project, which is better, running standalone jar or Tomcat server, and why? Interesting question, which comes up a lot. And the simple answer is that if you're using the standalone jar or if you're using Tomcat server, it's both the same Tomcat. It's just packaged differently. And you will have the very same experience. And there's just one difference is, what does your company, your organization want that you work at? So if your current company has a ton of dedicated Tomcat servers, and you tell them, I just want to deploy a standalone jar, they will probably tell you, don't do that, we have Tomcats. If you don't have that, and if you have cool admins, and if you want to be a bit more, well, modern, I suppose, then you can just go standalone jar and you'll be fine. But don't expect like a speed difference or anything crazy, because it's the same Tomcat. The next question is, what's the deployment option for Spring Boot developed application? I'm talking about servers besides Tomcat. What you can do is, so either you have these embedded web servers, Tomcat or Jetty come to mind, it's the two most popular options, or you have the option that you put the Spring Boot project into a WAR file, and then you can take that WAR file and put it into any application server you want. You can put it into your Glassfish and into whatever you're using at your own company. So you have both options. The WAR option, however, takes a bit more configuration, a bit more messing around with the POM.xml file. All right. I think we only have 10 minutes left, and I have to kind of get the full circle going with Spring Boot and show you what's going on there, how what we built right now correlates to whatever Spring Boot does. So let me get back to my screen sharing, actually. Right, screen share. Okay, so hopefully you can see me again. And now it's time again to, hopefully I have it still open. The
yes,
whole
you
Spring
can see perfectly. It's clear.
Yes, yes. The Spring Boot project. Okay, so I told you before that these starters, these are the ones you put into your POM.xml file. These starters only just add dependencies. Another question is, where is all that Spring Boot magic happening? And if you have written a Spring Boot project in the past, you know that there's one annotation that you put onto your main class, and it's the Spring Boot application annotation. And that will pretty much boot up Spring Boot. And what's important here is this one annotation saying that the Spring Boot application annotation itself comes with the enable auto configuration annotation. And this little annotation is what makes your Spring Boot project go crazy. Because when you have that annotation enabled, Spring will basically go inside the, well, let's say auto configure project, because it's one of the default dependencies, and it's basically the most important default dependency that comes with every Spring Boot project, because everything happens in the Spring Boot auto configure module. And you can see here that there's a couple of different packages for AMQP, for caching, Cassandra, for cloud, Deo, H2, JUG, everything mixed up. So every technology out there that is basically exists is inside that auto configuration package. And when you look at the JDBC package, for example, you'll see there's a class called auto configuration, Datasource auto configuration. When you go to Jackson, you'll see there's a Jackson auto configuration. When you go to integration, you'll see there's an integration auto configuration. There's all these different, every package has an auto configuration class, And that is exactly what this annotation does. It basically enables Spring to read in all these auto-configuration classes for you. And when you look at the data source auto-configuration, for example, let me make it a bit bigger. You see a couple of things. You have just a plain old, good old Spring configuration, just like we did. We did have, and forget these for the moment. And you can see there's two nested configurations, which makes it a bit ugly to read. But there's an embedded database configuration like we used, or there's a real database for production databases configuration, which is called pool data source configuration. And you suddenly see a couple of different conditional statements here. So conditional, that's what we wrote, something like that. Only create this configuration if the condition matches. And the condition is down here. The condition basically says, check if you have a property, spring.datasource.type. If that property is set, then create a pool data source configuration. And then even crazier is that, as you can see here with the import, you import 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different configurations. And these are all connection pool libraries, different libraries, which have nothing to do with each other. So you have a Hikari connection pool, you've got a Tomcat connection pool. Don't confuse that with the web server we just saw, because there's also a Tomcat connection pool. DBC2 connection pools, there's a couple of different connection pools. And when you now go inside the Hikari configuration, for example, you'll see there's a specific thing called conditional on class, which is if the Hikari data source class exists on your class path, the same thing we did before with Tomcat, then create the Hikari bean. If you have a data source class missing, so if I myself as a developer didn't specify explicitly a data source, just create the data source for me. Then also check that these two properties are set. So there's a couple of conditions that need to be true that our data source gets created. But that's pretty much how Spring Boot does it. Spring Boot has thousands of these conditions. And as you can see, before we only had conditional, because that's plain Spring. But Spring Boot comes with a couple of different annotations, a different package actually. And when you go inside that package, you see that in Spring Boot, you have this conditional on class annotation, which means is the class on the class path. Conditional on Java, if it's a specific Java version. Conditional on missing bean. If you don't have such a bean specified, then create one for me. Conditional on not a web application or on web application. So are you running a web application or are you not running a web application? Conditional on property. So there's all these different conditions. And when you think about Spring Boot, I want you in the future think about all these conditions so that at the beginning, Spring Boot boots up. It has a look at all these configurations that you'll find in the auto-configure package. And it will only create classes where you find that have the libraries on the class path, for examples, or specific properties are set. These are the two most important things to keep in mind. Specific properties are being set or libraries on the class path. And I think at the end, a quick, let's say, exercise for you also is you just saw how Spring Boot does, actually that's the wrong package here. I need to go into this package here. Spring Boot, I showed you the data source auto configuration. That's something we built. And what you obviously also can do is you can have a look at Tomcat and how Spring Boot boots up Tomcat with the servlet web server factory auto configuration. And I won't show it into detail here, but basically all the code we wrote at the beginning, you'll find in that auto configuration class. And when you then put Tomcat on the class path, Tomcat will boot up. If you put Jetty on the class path, Jetty will boot up. So everything happens with these auto configurations, basically. All right. Hopefully that was not too quick. Let's see if there's any other questions popping up to that auto configuration part. Let me just get back the screen share. Right. let's have a look where we left off.
There is a question related to embedded server.
Right. So we have the question related to the embedded server, which is actually a question to before. The thing is, yes, an embedded server is really enterprise ready and scale ready. It can handle a lot of transactions real time. But what you have to imagine is, whenever you think about an application handling transactions, you never talk about the web server. The web server itself can handle all these modern web servers. If it's embedded or not, can handle thousands of concurrent requests. It's really no problem. The problem is always the database, so that later on you basically hit the database with some big SQL query, which no one knows about, is way too complex, and that SQL query takes like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, and suddenly you run into problems. Or your application takes too long to calculate something or to do other stuff. So the web server itself is really not itself a problem. I've seen big applications run on embedded web servers easily. And big enterprise used to spend lots of money on application server like WebLogic. Yes, they did, but it gives you a good feeling, I suppose, and you have business support, which is also a good thing. But the reality is embedded stuff works just as well, because it really is the same technology behind, the same source code, just packaged up differently. Right. We have another question. If I wanted to override some auto configuration, how would I override the auto configuration? It's a good question. Let me get back into my screen share mode again. And just quickly, because then you'll see how simple it is, right? So here we go again. Actually, let's have a look at the Spring project. If you want to override something, you just make sure, first of all, that you write that bean. So in our case, you just write a bean with a type of data source. And then if you have a look inside what Spring Boot does again, so it'll have me just go to the JDBC package again, data source auto configuration, you can see there's a conditional on missing bean data source. So Spring will only execute that code if there is no bean that you yourself defined of type data source. So the way to override all this auto configuration is, well, one option is to just define your bean, but then you have to know the type, which is, in case of data source, quite simple actually, but it can be a bit tricky in other cases, and you'll need to read the documentation. And it's sometimes not as easy just overriding everything, but yeah, that's pretty much it. You can be sure that Spring always has these conditional or missing beans inside. So if you don't write it, Spring Boot will do it itself. And if you write it, Spring Boot will just ignore the whole thing. Right. Let me get back again. Okay, here we are. Words on Spring Boot 2. How do we prepare ourselves for an upgrade from 1.5 to Spring Boot 2? To be honest, the main concepts between, I'd say 85–90% between Spring Boot 1.5 and 2.0 or later, nothing changed for you as a developer. You have to, there's actually a good Spring Boot documentation page outside where you see what you need to change. And it's mostly about dependencies, mostly about properties, specific properties you have to change or that got renamed or something. But in terms of how do you configure databases and whatnot, it pretty much is all the same. And it's not, even though the version bump is quite big, it's not like you have a completely different project that does crazy stuff completely differently. You'll handle the transition just fine. But it's a bit of upgrading. I upgraded an application lately, and you have to mess around with a couple of dependencies and properties. That's what I remember.
Great.
All right.
Yeah, we don't have any more questions, I think. Hey, guys, if you have any more questions, please, this is the time. And we are almost over 1 hour. So let's uh, wait for a few minutes if you have any more questions.
Yes, and
So
also if you liked, maybe you're thinking, "Oh, that was a lot of information in a short time." Yes, you can have a look around at my website, and you can also check out some of these videos, which explain the same stuff again. And I also publish guides, written guides from time to time, if someone likes to read guides more. But in the end, the only thing I wanted to show you is that it's not about Spring versus Spring Boot. Spring Boot really is just Spring with a lot of auto configuration. And if that is what I could somehow teach you, then I'm already a happy guy.
Great. I'm sure everyone liked your session, and I have learned a lot from your talk. In fact, I didn't went through all of this, so it's really helped me. And thank you very much for your time. I'm sure our audience has learned a lot of new things as well. So I really appreciate.
Yeah, you're absolutely welcome. It was a pleasure. I like doing this kind of stuff.
So, do you want to show your site to our audience as well, so that they can see?
Sure, I can. Yeah. So let's go back to the screen share. All right. So when you go on my site, and I guess the name is pretty hard to pronounce and to remember for people from Bangladesh or other places around the world, but I have two main sections which you'll see, and hopefully I'll just make it a bit bigger. I'll have courses here and I have guides here. And when you click courses, you'll pretty much find different courses for different topics, how to work with files in Java, Java 8 features like lambdas and all these kind of stuff, Java 9 features, and some of the stuff I talked about in this session. If you scroll down, there's a couple of courses. It's in the Spring Boot Finally Understandable course, which is being published. I try to publish a couple of episodes every week. And when you scroll down, you can just play the full course, but in the end, you'll see a huge video where I go through all this stuff, just like I did in this session. And you can follow the code, you can follow the video, and later on, if you're registered, you can also download the source code and try to complete the exercises. So it's really just a video course site where you can try and learn about all these different things. And I also have guides, not as many at the moment, a guide to accessing databases in Java at the moment, to logging in Java. But these are pretty long guides. It's not like, I think you can see it here. So it takes a long time to read, right? Let's close that pop-up. It takes a long time, but it basically is everything that there is, hopefully in a nice and not too dry and stupid way, but in a good way to learn about, well, how would you access databases in Java? And how would you what is Hibernate, what is JPA, what are connection pools, drivers? So just talking about all these kind of stuff. And always, if you have any questions, guides, courses, anything, if you want to write me a quick mail, it sometimes takes me a while to reply, but I usually try to reply to everything, every feedback I get about any of these things. Right.
All right. So thank you, Marco. I really, it was really a great session, and I'm really grateful. You managed your time, and you. So
cool.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, and you all have, I suppose, a good night.
Yeah, and in fact, our audience also thanked you as well. In the comment section, you can see that. So it was really a great session. Thank you very much for your time and effort.
Cool, was a pleasure. See you next time.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.